in the case that we share this video more publicly, please take your video off at this time and or change your name as it appears on the screen for privacy purposes. Okay. Okay, so today we're gathering, this is the first ever Messy Conversations book club meeting, and we're going to be first listening to some discussion around Caste, the Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson, and we invite those of you who have had the opportunity to read this text, if you wouldn't mind, to either note that in the chat or to signal in a reaction whether you've had a chance to read the book, so we can kind of gauge where everyone's at and how much support we need to provide for the discussion in terms of helping people to be on the same page. So if you wouldn't mind, let us know if you've had a chance to read it. It's not a shame-based question, so if you haven't, we hope that you will find the time to read it and that you will be inspired by today's conversation to do so. Also, I would like to mention that we are hoping to read selections from Kendi's new book entitled 400 Souls next quarter. So if that's something you have time to review over the break, we will include that in the announcement for the next Messy Conversation as well. But just for those of you who like to read ahead, that's the plan. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Elaine Parker-Gills. She is an adjunct professor at Antioch University LA and has wonderfully been a conversationalist on many of our conversations. She's been teaching African American Studies courses in the Undergraduate Studies division for 3 decades, and as well as courses in the Graduate Education Department. Dr. Gills also served as Vice President of Community Engagement at Community Build Incorporated and is the founder of the W.E.B. DuBois Academic Institute. A consultant and community activist. Our second conversationalist is Kirsten Grimstad. Dr. Grimstad is professor and co-chair for Undergraduate Studies at AULA. The focus of her current project, The People's Guide to Berlin, examines the role of grassroots civic activism in establishing a sense of public awareness of and accountability for the murder of the Jews of Europe. How the Germans have faced up to their racist national history holds lessons for us for confronting the legacy of white supremacy that we are now grappling with. So thank you so much to both of you for being here. Also, just a shout out to SO1 Books, and I'll drop the link into the chat to remind you to, if you can, support them with any book purchases and also preparation for our next conversation on that topic of 400 souls. So thank you so much, and I'll let you take it away.
Well, welcome everyone. We're really excited to discuss this fascinating book. I think Messy Conversation provides an opportunity for our community to come together to discuss critical issues, which may at times be messy and uncomfortable. So we're delighted that we have this new edition, the book club component. And our first selection, I think, is extremely timely as we find ourselves, historically speaking, not only is this African American History Month, but African Americans and all US citizens find themselves in a position where white supremacy is on the rise, where democracy, our very democracy at stake, and we're looking at supremacists who feels that taking away the vote of Americans, particularly African Americans, is something that is acceptable. So as we move along today, I want to just introduce you to Isabel Wilkerson, who is really a widely acclaimed author. And she was first introduced, her book, Warmth of Other Suns. And she's Pulitzer Prize winner for that particular book. And it's on a very important topic in American and African American history. And it's on the Great Migration, where over 6 million African Americans moved from the South to the North, to the Midwest, to freedom for a different opportunities to escape Jim Crow, white supremacy, the Black codes, leasing of human beings. It's a focus from really the 1619 forward. And her new book, she says that doing that extensive research on the Great Migration, she felt that looking at getting an explanation of the racial hierarchy and the supremacy in this country was worth exploring. And she does that in Caste, the Origins of Our Discontent. Now, pretty much this critical period that she addresses in her book, what's significant is that she looks at caste in 3 classifications. The 4,000-year system in India. Secondly, the Nazi regime, the supremacy and the dealing with the final solution of Jews in Nazi Germany. And thirdly, US racism and that hierarchy. And she presents the case that we in this country live under a racial system that can be classified in caste. Now, the lower caste being African Americans, upper class being white Americans, and the middle class being Asians and Hispanics. And while this is not a new subject because it was looked at by Cox in the 1930s in Class and Race, she has a fresh take. She examines, and I think in a particularly strategic way, where she combines storytelling, interviews, and really explores in a way that I think is so engaging and really has a focus that as Americans we should look at. Obviously, we're in the company of racial hierarchy, but how we view that as Americans is very important. So I think her book is very critical to our understanding. And I want to ask Kirsten to please give her views and what are her thoughts on the book as it looks at paralleling Nazi regime and US racism.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. Thank you for that introduction to the book. And I guess before I speak about the parallel and overlap that she establishes between racial caste in the U.S. and racial caste in the Third Reich, I'd just like to add one other perspective by way of introduction, which is that Wilkerson's approach to her subject, you referred to this, the way she blends together so many different modes.
You're mute, Kirsten.
Sorry, thank you. The way she weaves the material together, very, very disparate material that she weaves together using metaphors so powerfully. That is what makes this book so compelling, I would say. Anyway, so she talks about the racial caste system in the US as being like it's our old house. We've inherited this house. It's got a lot of problems in it, but it's inherited. We didn't build it, but it's ours. It's ours to deal with. And that, I think, sets a good framework for our approach. So in terms of her, the parallel and overlap that she's developing, she starts the book actually with this piece called "The Man in the Crowd." And she's referring to this very famous photograph of a Nazi rally in 1936. Shipyard workers, they're all doing the Hitler salute. Hundreds of people doing the Hitler salute, all in one direction. There's one person, and there's the upper right-hand corner of the picture who's got his arms crossed. He is not doing the Hitler salute, and he stands out. And she's asking us, would we be that person? She's challenging, she's provoking us. She's saying, wait, what I'm talking about here, what I'm developing in this book is a parallel to Nazi Germany. Now, given that parallel, are we the person who refuses to go along with the dominant ideology? She poses that at the beginning, and she then refers back to it at the end. So it sets us up to think about racial caste in the US in terms of what is widely understood to be one of the most horrendous chapters in history. The Third Reich and the murder of the European Jews and Roma and Sinti and disabled people and others. I think the strongest part of her book on this point is her discussion of this work by Whitman, a book that appeared in 1917 called Hitler's American Model. And she summarizes this very well. And she talks about how when the Nazis in 1934 were designing the blood laws, what would become the Nuremberg laws, they looked to the American model. They looked to the Americans to see how did the Americans manage to have these miscegenation laws and get away with it. It could be considered an upright nation among nations. And they studied the writings of these American eugenicists, Stoddard and Madison Grant, who were, one of them wrote the book, what's it called? The Menace of the Underman. Well, the Germans borrowed that word, the Untermensch, and they labeled the Jews Untermensch, subhumans, basically subhumans. So that was the dehumanizing way that they referred to the Jews, and then they were involved in supporting the sterilization program in the Third Reich. Where the first disabled people were being forcibly sterilized. Roma and Sinti were forcibly sterilized. Jews, many of them also, especially if they had mental illnesses. So this was a very, very strong piece of, I thought, of the book, and very compelling. There are other aspects. She also refers to, she talks about the well, this gets into sort of the aftermath, but she talks about the Confederate monuments in the U.S. and how sacred these are, and how the resistance to removing these monuments to people who were basically traitors to the United States. And that whole, you know, that torchlight parade was over the removal of one of these Confederate statues, and how in Germany there are no statues, there are no monuments to the Nazi people. And instead there are monuments commemorating the victims of the Nazi regime, and monuments and documentation centers that expose the perpetrators in every way. So honoring the victims by name and with their stories, bringing back the victims by name, and naming all of the perpetrators, people who wrote letters of denunciation. They are on display in the Topography of Terror. So those are two sides of what she's presenting here that are, I thought, very powerful parts of her overall analysis. So let's go back to you, Elaine.
Well, I think you bring some really critical points, and I'm hoping that our audience, our community, will help further engage those that have read the book. Because what she also points out is that through her research and through history, she brings it all the way forth to the Trump administration, to, obviously the issues that are taking place in this country relative to how, the history of Black people, but also how it is being dealt with by other Americans. And she gives examples of, as an African-American woman in her profession, how the attitudes of Americans and the perception of her as an African-American woman, what she has gone through. And I think that gives us an opportunity to see how we perceive one another. More importantly, how do we perceive individuals that are considered part of the lower caste? Do we in fact perceive certain people in a way that says that you are less of a person? Are we coming to grips with that? And are we willing to dig further? W.E.B. Du Bois talks about the propaganda of history. And I could relate that to what Wilkerson is saying in this caste system. He's saying that there is what he calls an agreement lies agreed upon. And what can we do to dismantle that? And I think we can start by looking at this system. Is it a caste system? What are the parallels? So that I think that as we move forward, and I always think that messy conversation just really affords us that opportunity to look and to study more. Look at the history beyond 1 month and take the challenge.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that I think this is most important to us.
She really challenges us to think about these things. I mean, she's portraying the caste system in India is thousands of years old, and you think, well, wow, that's pretty intractable. And at one point, she calls it the skeleton, and race is the skin. Caste is the skeleton, race is the skin.
Mm-hmm.
Or another place, she calls it a virus that mutates and keeps carrying on its infections through generation after generation after generation. The infrastructure, she calls it the infrastructure of human systems of ranking. And it, as I read, I was so struck by these words, these metaphors that she used, and she keeps adapting her metaphors. I liked that as well. If you didn't like this one, if you didn't like the old house, how about the infrastructure or the skeleton? You know, so, but it's hard to change your skeleton. This is what I was grappling with, and she does talk about the need for something like a truth and reconciliation process in the US. She doesn't develop that too much, but this is where it seems to me she's on the mark, because unless we are willing to look at all of this history and not blind ourselves. I feel like we are blind. Our Americans have been blind, especially when I compare to the Germans, for example, who have looked at their history and said, we are wrong and we must change. You know, there's still a lot of anti-Semitism and radical right-wing stuff going on in Germany, but from the federal level, that is the policy, is to recognize the horror, the atrocities, name them, even when it's your own ancestors. And I admire that. I think that goes a long way.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think when we look at this parallel that she does in the comparisons are powerful, because it says, as she presents it, when you look at South Africa, apartheid, and this country is known as practicing apartheid American style, it in fact, we have not come to grips with truth and reconciliation. We remain with the rose-colored glasses. And I think that at the very least, this piece, which is well-researched and really woven so that we could converse about it, says that we're going to have to get started. We're going to have to re-examine. And I noticed Clarence was saying about white supremacy during the Civil War. And yet it continued after the war. And in Germany, one of the reasons that we're having this, the right wing has over the past decade, is that in German school books, at one point they were not dealing with Nazism as if it didn't happen. And we're doing the same in this country. And then we have the 1619 Project, And right away, just a few weeks ago, the Trump administration, as he was leaving, reluctantly, they published a 1776 report. So the miseducation continues, and how we grapple with and come to terms with this, I think is going to really make the difference. And certainly in community, university community, education, we certainly can take that challenge. We certainly have to, I think.
I think the 1619 project has a great deal of potential for changing the educational approach to our history. And you know, in the German school system, the children are introduced to the Holocaust in elementary school. Here's what happens. They start by doing research in their neighborhood to identify people who had lived in their neighborhood, Jewish people who had lived in their neighborhoods who were murdered. And then they find out about those people, and then they write a story about them. And it's usually someone who has like the same first name as they, or a child who has the same birthday or something like that. That's how it starts. And then eventually, when they're in high school, they all go to a concentration camp. That's part of the curriculum. And sometimes they have these school projects where they initiate the stumbling stones that Wilkerson talks about, to the little brass memorial plaques that go into the sidewalk outside of the home where the person once lived. And I've seen this. I've seen high school students perform a ceremony around the Jews who had lived in their neighborhood, and they sponsored these stumbling stones and they conducted the ceremony. So this is the kind of way that awareness of the racist national history is taught, and not to shame people, but to spur a sense of responsibility for making sure that this never happens again. Can we get there? This is what I want to know. I don't know, is it time to invite everyone else to chime in now? What do you think, Elaine? Is there anything else you'd like to?
Well, just lastly, perhaps I think you've touched on it, because of the research you have done, and how do you see caste? So maybe your major takeaway.
My major takeaway?
Yes.
So my major takeaway is the way in which she ends the book, which is calling upon people individually to participate in the process of forging relationships across caste, getting to know people across caste, and in that way resisting the caste protocols, and that's yes, I think that's important, in that individuals do that. And I can offer that in Germany, in Berlin, which I'm most familiar with, it is individuals and artists and grassroots organizations that brought about the change that she's writing about with admiration in Germany. It didn't come from the government. It came from the pressure of grassroots people doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
That's my takeaway is
Yeah.
her ending.
Yeah, and I agree. I think we both agree, and most people, action and engagement, it's going to take that. And I think we are, here we are, we're almost to the anniversary of George Floyd's killing. And since then, there have been, numerous, situations that people have lost their lives. And we are faced with domestic terrorism. So at some point, institutions of higher learning, various organizations, and of course, individuals will have to take a stand. And one last thing, I in her book, she so invested in Caste, in the explanation, or at least examining it critically, that she doesn't actually ascribe race as a major issue. She thinks it's so deeply embedded in how we live and act and how we perceive and how we look at individuals, rather than the university setting, in our communities, in our workplaces. And I think it really gets down to, Zora Neale Hurston has a piece called Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick. We find a way to strike the blow. And it's going to happen in different ways, but certainly that's the takeaway that we need to pursue. So hopefully we can open up to some questions and or just comments.
There's so much more to say about this book, but I'd like to hear what others have to say.
Thank you both. The first comment I see in chat is David. I have a question about the value of using Caste as a primary lens of analysis in the US. Do you want to say more, David?
Yeah, just real quickly. First, thank you, Elaine and Kirsten. And, I've got a mixed relationship with the book. There's a lot I appreciate. I was not aware, for instance, of the Nazis using the United States as the model for their system. And that some of the Nazis resisted that because they thought we were too extreme. And like, okay, that's something I hadn't run across before. So I appreciate that. On the other hand, and I also appreciate that she challenges me conceptually. And that's what my question is around. It seems like, we're just now starting to get folks to look at race and to look at race systemically and structurally, and to engage in that conversation. And then she is saying, oh, no, race is a subset of something deeper, caste. And so shifting the conceptual tool of analysis from race to caste. And I'm not sure what I think of that. And so if that's the best strategy at this point, if there's something to it. I mean, when I think about India and caste, that's rooted in a cosmology.
4,000 years. Yeah.
That we don't share. So anyway, I'd love to hear your or anyone else's thoughts on the advantages or possible disadvantages of shifting to caste as our principal tool of analysis.
Well, let me start off, and I would love to hear from others. I absolutely agree, because I think this is a re-examination. And as I mentioned, Cox's book of Race, Class, race has to be central. I mean, that's what makes this, starting with the peculiar institution of enslaved people in Africa, no doubt about it. But I think this can help us on our journey to look at caste, do an analysis, comparing. I mean, the Nazis certainly thought, oh, they certainly have it together, almost a little bit too much. And can we handle that? So I know that's race. Certainly it's race. So I agree. And I was just wondering what others thought that had read the book or even aware of conversations about caste and race in America.
I'll just throw in my own perspective and quickly, and that is that I agree that the issue for us is race. What she offers is a way of thinking about human ranking in general and the hierarchy. And it does help me to see the hierarchy of human ranking as it works here in our situation as compared to these other situations. And there are many societies that have hierarchies of ranking, but anyway, so that's what was illuminating for me about it, and that's what I appreciated. Other people. Anyone want to weigh in?
So
I'll start with one. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think Sarah Beth is curating the questions for us.
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, so did somebody say they wanted to weigh in, or did we?
Yeah,
I heard somebody, but I didn't see who it was.
that's Carol.
Yeah, that was me. I didn't know I had to put it in the chat first. Can I just weigh in?
Yes, please go ahead,
Okay.
Carol. Thanks.
All right. Well, yeah, I found this very interesting, and I got through maybe a quarter, almost half of it, and there was so much in that. And first of all, like I was born in 1952 in Detroit, and there's a part about everyone's in their container, and I was born in that container. And this is all like mind-blowing to me. All these things that I grew up with and accepted as being, a Black girl in Detroit, was just the way that it was. And my father was born in 1916, and I'm into genealogy, so I know a little bit more about my background. My father was born in Boston, and his grandmother was born in Tennessee. And my mother's family came from Camden, South Carolina. And we have a genealogist in our family that traced it her. And so like I knew, like my early 20s, that we were, descended from slaves, I'm the great granddaughter, that kind of thing. But to me, growing up, we went to school with Polish kids, Hamtramck. And my father did a lot to shelter us. I mean, I was just going to say, he taught, I kind of figured out our place, as being Black kids, going to certain stores. Hudson's was like a big, really like white, privileged department store, like Macy's or Gimbel's, or some of the other stores in New York, where if you did go in, you had to dress up and present yourself in a certain way. And that was DuBois about education and being respectable and all that. And what I'm trying to get to is that I'm one of those people who are born into that container and had to navigate that. And there's, as far as caste or class, like even in my neighborhood, most of, all the, if you were Black, you were in the Black neighborhood, right? And there were classes or castes of people that were Black, but then, there was the teacher that was the teachers next door that were considered maybe a better than someone else. And there were some other people down the block that actually worked in like the city government. And then there were, my father was, he worked at the factories, so we were all in there together. But even in a block, in my neighborhood, what I was thinking was class. I guess what your guys are saying is caste, but it seems very similar to me because every race or people have that hierarchy anyway. I mean, it's just sort of natural human nature. I don't know what my point is, but I'm just telling you that, with India, I was really aware of that, but I have to read the book. I'm also listening to the audiobook. I have a study guide, and it's going to take me months to really, get my head around the whole thing. But caste and class within a subgroup, that's something I grew up with. And I know about, the slavery, I know more than I wanted to know about it. But I think that's the education is just so important. Even someone my age, there's so much I didn't realize. And I wasn't taught this in school, elementary school in the 50s and 60s at all. Not at all, but I saw it in the 60s. Dr. Gills is having a Black church course coming up, and I was raised Baptist. And I remember Dr. Luther King and my father took us on a march in 1963 down in Detroit, and my little brother, the stroller and everything. So I was aware of all that. But it's the voting rights. And it's, when I was 18, you voted. Everyone voted, you had that right. And I remember sitting in the basement of our church next to these church ladies who were just waiting for their opportunity to vote. It was just so important, and this is an important book, but I hope that it leaks. It should be required reading for everybody, especially school children. But we have a big hole to dig out of. That's me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I think you spoke really eloquently to the complexity of holding this and grappling with it and how long it might take many of us. Jacqueline next says, will America ever have the courage to name perpetrators of slavery and forward individuals that have impacted and solidified the caste system in this country? Some documentaries are addressing this issue individually. Jacqueline, did you want to say more?
This time I will. You almost got me. No, I was just wondering about that because of what Kirsten was saying, and just remembering when I visited Berlin, it was just like in your face, and it was at first it was shocking to see all the information about the Nazis and what had happened in the wars, all the various implications, socially, financially, everything. And then after you're there for a little while, you start to take all this information and you realize you're not standing there by yourself learning these things. There's all these different people. Some of them might be German, some of them are not. And you're hearing all these different languages because people are going there and they're learning more. And then it hits you as an American that we don't discuss these things at all. We have monuments and we have museums, and then a lot of the things that are even in the museums, it makes you wonder, a lot of it is not even, a good chunk of it's not even our history. You would want to see more of our history and have an understanding instead of separating it out. So I've been watching all these documentaries where people are actually apologizing for some of the atrocities that have happened in the South in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that are being made, and how these white families are going back and saying, you know, we all knew it was a lie, but no one was brave enough to fix it or to say it. And so I'm just wondering if, you know, that was just one of the questions. As part of Caste, we have to address the way that it should be addressed. How can it be addressed?
Yeah. Can I just jump in here and say that I think we're seeing some evidence of perpetrators being identified and held accountable to some extent, and that's coming out of universities that are doing research into they're doing decolonizing research into their origins. And so people like John Calhoun, who was donor, benefactor to Yale, I believe it was, you know, his name is coming off of the residence hall and the other places. And you hear about this, you see this happening more and more, where people who were slaveholders are losing their place of prestige. That's the one thing I can say about that. And I agree, that is actually what is central about the German story, is naming the perpetrators at all levels, not just mourning the victims. That's very important, but also naming the perpetrators. Yeah.
Thank you. Jacqueline also said, at least Germany is willing to teach the history with accurate information. Also, the history is all inclusive, not separated by the ideology of race. And one other thing that you asked, Jacqueline, I think that's a great invitation to everyone, is, does anyone want to share their favorite passage from the book and why? So if you can do that in the chat, that would be wonderful as we move along here. Did you want to say anything more, Jacqueline, on either of those fronts?
No, I just wanted to see what other people thought about it, you know, pieces that they, like Elaine had first in, what pieces stood out for them. I was just kind of curious.
Lollie has shared, has anyone watched the series Amend? The most recent one was the 14th. I'm sorry, I'm bad at reading these. Just my dyslexia is present. 14th Amendment, and brought up some points on citizenship and race. I should have read the rest of the question before I tried to translate. Thank you, Lollie.
Yeah, it's a great series, and the one on the 14th Amendment really got into a lot of these real details about race and how hard it was, you know, post-Civil War, and, you know, what was going on to try to get citizenship and what that meant. to be granted citizenship and what it meant to be denied citizenship. So if you haven't seen it, it's a great series. It's hosted by Will Smith, you know, the actor. And then they have, like last night, it was a lot of focus on Frederick Douglass. And then they'll have, you know, actors kind of reading from their material and then, you know, kind of tying it in, and a lot of really interesting photos and visuals from the time they're talking about as well. So it's an interesting series. I recommend it if you haven't been able to see it. Is it on Netflix? You know, I don't remember. You know, Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, they've all become sort of a wash of, you know, well, it's somewhere, you know, I don't really know what it's called, but it's the series is called Amend.
Thank you so much for that. So next is Patrick has a comment about our professional practices.
Good evening, everyone.
Patrick?
My apology for not having my camera on. I'm actually driving. Two quick things. Number one, I just want to comment about and revisit the comments about, you know, colleges, universities are taking, you know, benefactors' names off buildings and things like that. But a lot of these places, especially the more the older, you know, more well funded institutions, have endowments that were set up by these individuals way long time ago, and, you know, are millions up to, you know, some places billions of dollars that they've accumulated over the years. And so I'm less impressed by them taking names off buildings. I want to see what they do with those funds that were donated by those people that, you know, the money was generated from slave labor and things like that. So I'd be more impressed if they take that money and do something with it and not just take a name off the building. So, and number two, you know, thinking about how do we improve practice at Antioch? I mean, we're a higher education institution, we're a university, and we have a natural caste system ourselves. It's faculty, usually faculty at the top, and it's administrators, and it's kind of everybody else. And staff is kind of like, you know, the lowest on the totem pole with, you know, the least say, the least recognizable. And, you know, that, and I've been at 4 or 5 different universities in my career, and it's always the same caste system there. It's just, you just know that if you're a staff member, you know, you don't say anything, because especially say anything against a faculty member, because that'll get you fired. And, you know, we have a natural caste system that we operate in. So before we look at, you know, changing the world, maybe we look at how we operate as a higher education institution.
Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate your comment. So the next one I see here is ACES. One major difference between Germany and the US may be worth noting. The Jewish population of Germany was almost non-existent after World War II. Maybe it's easier to address your history if it's no longer a threat to your continued political domination. Asa, did you want to say more on this before?
Yeah, I can just mention, I think it was a larger question that I had while reading the book, which I thought is really amazing. And she's such a great writer and brings in so much interesting research. And there were a lot of times where the parallels between the 3 caste systems she's examining didn't quite click for me, or that I wasn't quite sure of the value of putting these next to each other as a similar kind of system. There just seem to be so many vast differences between them, and it's the racial hierarchy in the US that seems to be so dominant, which is not at all a factor in India, or works completely differently. And then in Germany, there's a whole different racial ideology, or like use of the caste system, which there's a lot in the book on, you know, the function of the lowest class, that it's needed for everyone else, that it's like a necessary part of keeping the order. But the goal of the Nazis was to completely eliminate that entire caste. So in that case, what would the function be? So there's some like tensions there, but yeah, that's a long way of just kind of getting at what that comment was. And yeah, it'd be interesting to hear if other people I think David brought it up too, but like if all the parallels connected for everyone.
Yeah, they don't all connect. I agree with you on that. And the 12 years of the Third Reich and the 400 years of the US story are hard to line up, really. And yet I think of her book as a kind of thought experiment. And I'm willing to go with her on that, you know, even though it doesn't all line up quite, you know, it's still it's very provocative to me, and so that's I guess I give her a pass on, and also because she opens up so many new things that I like. She treats this thing that I found really interesting was the story of these two couples, these anthropologists who went to Natchez to do this sort of undercover study of the racial caste system in the Deep South in 1933. I thought that was really, really fascinating. So I'm just grateful to her for all of these kinds of gems that her book contains.
Thank you so much. I'm mindful that we're nearing 5 p.m. So would like to make space to say thank you to those of you who have to go now. And you're most welcome to stay and have more conversation on this if you can. Otherwise, you can catch the video next time in our message flyer that comes through the email. All the links to previous conversations are there for you. So I'm just going to pause us for a minute and allow people to take some time to go or to stick around. Thanks for being here.
I have a follow-up to get us started in this more intimate conversation. Kind of a follow-up to my original question, and then Asa, I really appreciate where he went with that, and I got a couple of chats as well about the same idea. And I'm wondering, is caste just easier for white people to talk about than race? Is that what we're doing here?
I'd like to comment on that. And I go back to the book, and I believe Caste's book was 1948, Caste, Class, and Race, a Study in Social Dynamics. And it was largely overlooked. And even in Wilkerson's book, she pretty much dismisses it, because his focus was on race and, you know, the uniqueness of this experiment in this country. And it is also said that because, even though the book is widely acclaimed, and I certainly think it's a fascinating book, and I think David, it helps us get to the core. Most Americans, they don't look at caste, they don't associate it with this system here. And I would wager to say most Americans are not going to be reading Caste. But you see, because she did Warmth of Other Suns and she won the Pulitzer, it garnered a lot of attention. So I'm happy because more people will, you know, voice it, pull that bell a little bit. But sometimes caste can be conveniently used because it may be just a little easier to not necessarily justify, but put us on, you know, may perhaps make it a little easier. So that has been introduced, but I do agree with Asa and everyone else that it may not, the parallels just may not be what we would want to see, but it just opens it up a bit for us, because certainly it cannot be explained away, and sometimes Caste will give you that opportunity. Now, I think that she was most definitely saying that we need to take a look at it, but sometimes I was a little troubled, and I told Kirsten about some of the examples that are used in the book, where, you know, the way people, you know, perceived and, you know, looked at her as upper middle class African-American woman. And those are the examples that she used. So I just think it's a lot of, you know, a number of conflicts in this whole discourse. But I think that's what will make it easier for us to get where we need to go, perhaps.
I love the silence.
What do you think about the silence?
I love the silence. There's so much information in the silence. I know Dr. Gill had pointed out the comment I made about when I felt the genesis of the caste system started in the United States, which was at the onset of the Civil War, simply because it was important for the planters and the Confederates to establish, you know, this hierarchy in a way that the indentured servants and the other lower class Europeans who had come as part of this experiment to build America, they did not want them to partner up with the slaves and join the Union Army like so many slaves were doing. So for me, I really felt like that was the genesis of it. But when you think about plantation life, there was a caste system that was replicated even on the plantations of the South, when you had the house Negro juxtaposed to the field Negro, juxtaposed to the overseer, juxtaposed to the white field worker / sharecropper. There was already an established caste system, you know, that was already in its operation. And then the fear of the slave owners, when they felt like, you know, with these slaves running away to join the Union Army, we better remind these other lower class white people that you're part of us. You know, you're not Black, you know, at least you're not Black. So, you know, you have more power, you have more stature, you have more footing in this established society that we presented. So I always love bringing context into the subject, because I'm an eternal student of Dr. Parker-Gills. So, you know, when we're talking of the United States, I just wanted to offer that. And I've not gotten halfway through the book because I'm a fledgling graduate student who's just trying to keep above water.
You're on the path, my brother. You're on the path.
Yeah, I would just like to add on to what Clarence was saying, because we, you know, working with students, especially working with African American students on a small campus where you're trying to build a sense of community that had a large influx of African students, and the thing that was discouraging to me during that time was that the African students, as well as the Asian students, were told not to interact with the African American students by the international coordinator, the international student coordinator, because they were told, you know, if you start associating with the African American students, you're going to have other issues that you that you're not aware of, and it had a lot to do with the way that Black students were treated. So, and that's not new. It's going back to immigration and immigrants that come to this country. They figure out who's at the bottom and then how to. I have to prove my loyalty, so I have to continue to push down who's at the bottom, as well as not associate myself at the same time to stay at the top. But on campuses, it's difficult, it's sad that it continues, especially when you have people that continue the rhetoric. And that's not, I'm not talking about Antioch, I'm talking about a previous campus, so I will put that out there. So Clarence is definitely starting something with that revelation.
Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's book Americana treats that topic of the Nigerian who moves to the US and encounters racism in the US. That would be a book I would love to talk to y'all about if ever you want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to just throw out there also in terms of maybe taking it a step further than Professor Jefferson, in terms of, I'm just a great believer in attaining knowledge. There is so much history out there that can help lead us. I was thinking the other day of David Walker's Appeal. There's a book called Crossing the Danger Water, 300 Years of African-American Writing. And I can remember students, Black and white students, and everybody going, 300 years? Come on now, Dr. Gills. We don't know our history, and we need to really get a grip on this. We're now just addressing monuments and statues that tearing the country apart because people want to tear down statues. We are finding out through student organizations that these elite universities were built on the blood, sweat, and tears and the auctioning of enslaved people. People were sold off, human beings were sold off at Georgetown to take care of a mortgage and extend the campus. And so here we are. So she's reintroducing caste. And perhaps those enlightened enough that we're discussing it, which means that we may be familiar with another book or some type of history, and it's, that doesn't happen just once, 1 month a year. I think that's what we're going to have to pursue, and those of us, we're going to have to lead. And it's quite interesting that Dr. King was pretty much enamored by Gandhi, and when he went, he was insulted because they considered him untouchable because they saw that Black face. And we know what race means and stands for, and that I think this only helps us to go deeper. That's what I say. I think we have to go deeper, and I think that there's a great deal of potential, and it's going to be up to us. People that's taking time, an hour every Monday, probably going to be the ones. And we're really looking forward to, you know, resurrecting the BSU. And I think some of the questions, all due respect to Kirsten and I, some of the questions and comments afterwards have really been the most enriching, and it can really help us. Glad to hear from, you know, students and everyone to keep us engaged.
You know, it's interesting when we talk about Black culture, and I'm speaking of the diaspora, and I know at one of our conversations, I'm sure I shared this, being in Canada several years ago, there was a South African woman, and I called her Black. I referenced her as being Black, and she absolutely went off on me, because in the culture that she was from in South Africa, just because she was a light-skinned Black person does not make her Black. She said she was colored. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to offend you, but that's not how it translates in America, where I come from. But she was very clear that, you know, Black people, even on a certain level, were in a certain caste, you know, based on their skin color and their connection with the Afrikaners, you know. And I guess in our world, when we look at America, the mulattoes, who were then begotten by the slaveholders by raping or by impregnating their enslaved women, you know, a whole other caste system spun from that, you know, with the young mulatto men being sent to to Europe to be educated, to the young women who are mulatto being groomed and tended for the other planter men to have these side families with. And there's a term for that they use in New Orleans. Maybe someone can tell me that it's a French term they use for this kind of concubine family that the planter had on the side. But you know, it's interesting how we look at caste system, you know, not just the Indian one, but the other cultures as well, especially the Black ones. I find fascinating.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So to this point about the need to face up to our history, I heard an interview with Isabel Wilkerson. I forget who she was talking to, but the topic of reparations came up, and she said that she considered her two books, Warmth of Other Suns and Caste, as being Exhibit 1 and Exhibit 2 in the case for reparations, which she doesn't actually say in the book, but it certainly, you can't, or I came away from it, I didn't need to be convinced of this, but that something serious is owed to the people from whom so much was taken. And I was, you know, I hope at one of our Messy Conversations sessions we can take this up in conjunction with some reading. I'm not sure what it might be, but.
And to that point, Kirsten, the 1619 Project is also a clear argument for reparations as well, because it truly illuminates all of the injustices, the mistreatment, and the theft of humanity displayed from 1619 to the present. So, yes, I would agree with her in stating that.
Yeah, yeah. I have the sense that Americans have never paid a price for these kinds of crimes. You know, we leave wreckage everywhere in the world, and we never pay a price. And I think that that's why the pattern doesn't change.
Well,
Oh,
currently,
yes.
new
I-
administration is talking about reparations. I mean, Biden made it part of his campaign promise to look at reparations for Black people, and he added on Indigenous people. And of course, that to me made me angry in a sense, because the Indigenous people were offered a sense of reparations, even though they were lied to and those treaties were broken, and that's never been fixed. But I didn't think that he should enjoin reparations for Black people with the reparations for Indigenous people. So that's kind of a thorn in my side right now. We'll wait to see what he does or how he addresses it, but it's just interesting that he would parlay the two together, which I think one has nothing to do with the other.
But the fact that it's even being spoken of seems significant to me. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's been on the table for a while, but the former President Obama said that while he certainly understands the quest for reparations, he mentioned, other groups and how they might look at that. So it is complex, but then again, it's not. But everything's political. But I certainly think that you're definitely correct, Clarence, that now is the time. And it's on committee, but when asked about it, the press secretary said that it has to go through, the system. She wasn't confirming so much.
Yeah, HR 45 was passed to McConnell's dismay. And so, but all HR 45 does is allows Congress to have a committee to look into what there might be in terms of setting up a system to examine it. They're not looking at solutions to it, which is really kind of crazy. It's like our government always—
Another committee,
another commission to think about how they might think about it.
Well, so that's, that is one of the points that Isabel Wilkerson makes.
I think
is that in Germany there was restitution.
Then the final analysis. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that in Germany, restitution.
I was just saying, I think it was an excellent starting point for our book club.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, muted.
Everybody there?
I'm here. I just was looking at what Carol said regarding the journalism role and crossing a line, putting her experiences in the book. And I've been thinking about this a lot. Like when we come to something that we're passionate about, especially in academia, and how we in qualitative research bracket. But what does that look like when we're sharing information with people and discussing the reality of experience? And as a white person, especially, I feel that it's part of what was helpful for me in understanding the connections that she was making throughout the text. And probably because I'm trying to hold my own experience while I'm doing this work, while I'm with students and trying to be different than I was before. It's made it impossible for me to hold bias and pretend that, that working toward the neutrality is useful anymore. especially with regard to this issue of anti-racist work. And so I appreciate you putting that out there, Carol. I'm interested to hear more about what you have to say.
Well, I mean, I was just putting something in the chat. I think that like most people of color have examples of like being followed around in department stores because, you know, you're Black or whatever, and they're expecting you to steal. I mean, there's so many examples, you know, apart from, you know, the example that she put in a book about, you know, going through the airport and all that, that she could have sourced. And that happens. I mean, and that's another thing that that even, you know, when I think every person of color or African-American person, no matter, you know, when they were born, even now, have to kind of maneuver perceptions. What in the 80s, I finished university, Wayne State University, and I went to San Francisco. Even before that, if you don't mind me, you know, I have experiences. When I went to San Francisco, I had my degree, bachelor's degree, and like so many people of my age left home to go to other places. Like there were white girls that had the same education that I did. But I got put into the support positions, secretary or assistant, where there was one instance that there was 2 or 3 of us in a waiting room for an advertising company or something. And I was interviewed, and I was offered the support position, but the white girl next to me was offered a kind of step up, you know, position where there was an advancement or more experience or more like in publishing. You know, there's the assistants and the secretaries, and then there are the assistant editors. See, that's the career track, and I experienced that, you know, like in advertising, and I worked at a radio station in San Francisco. I was a support, and you know, a woman with the same education or just starting out, those starter jobs, she got the sales job, which was another track, you know, for her to have a career and earn more money and all that. So, I mean, if you just talk to your friends or your girlfriends or whatever, there are plenty of those kind of examples. And that's part of being put in that container. And it was just something that, you know, you're in a position that you have to deal with. You know, it's just expected, or there's no surprise. It's frustrating, you know, and everything. But yeah, so if that kind of helps round that out.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Very true, very true, very true.
I'm sorry, I'm still looking through the chat here. There's so many interesting comments, and I just wondered if there's anything else we want to highlight as a group here before we close for the day. I appreciate the comments Nicole's made about the Reconstruction period failed, and Asa sharing. It seems like this was a really valuable experience for us as a group to have this time to focus on a text. Is there anything anyone wants to highlight before we end today?
I think it's funny and cool that Asa wants to do the book club all the time. Of course.
Wants to do
Part
the
of my
book.
job description, I have to be, I have to
Right.
promote the book clubs.
I think it's a great example of the anti-racist work for those of us who are white people, where we actually take a look in our field. What can we do? How can we change this? How can we be different? And I so appreciate your contributions, Asa, and I feel like it is an important way forward for all of us, that we can each take steps to do this work, looking specifically at the things we've learned and the tools and skills that we bring in, how we can move ourselves with that. So anything else?
So for our next book club, it was Clarence who said when we put out the call, he said 400 Souls, this anthology, this new anthology. And so it's 400 pages. We're not going to read the whole thing. We'll have selections. We haven't quite figured out which selections and who's going to decide. But in any case, that's what's up for next term, for the spring term, is 400 Souls at the request of one of the participants. So, if you like this, think about what book you'd like to read and talk about in this space for summer or for fall.
Mhm.
Also, before we go, I see a couple of comments here. Nicole, would you clarify what you're saying here about the history that you would like to see us to focus on, and if there's something beyond what I'm hinting at?
See, I wasn't trying to say anything. I was just saying that I really like the discussion as it went, although it doesn't pertain to this particular book, Caste. I would love to do a messy conversation about how Caste is pertained to cultures, particularly since I've experienced both Black culture, of course, but I've also spoken with students of color from other countries, such as India, where race, which is an American system, is not a factor in India, but color definitely is a factor in their caste system. And of the fairer color, you get more privileges. And this was something that I was told by one of the students who did our senior symposium on how Indian culture and caste kind of conflict when it comes to getting psychological help and counseling for issues there, dealing with that. Just to dive into it, especially with the casting system that many Black Americans don't notice that we had between the house nigga and the one on the field, and how that was established by them. The construction was made as a caste system to bring more peace of mind, that if you had a child or somebody who was of the white skin, they would always try to attain that whiteness and not murder their slave owner in the middle of the night, which is why they slept in the house, because they were more trusted than the other slaves who were darker. And how that dynamic came about working on a plantation and getting more history, like Clarence brought up about the history and that's documented in places like Louisiana and whatnot, on where they have some stuff that's written down that hasn't been destroyed yet that we could refer to if that. Anyway, I've said my piece. That's it. Thank you all. Wonderful discussion.
Thanks, Nicole. Do you want to make any comment about the surviving BSU? We're so glad to hear that's true.
Oh, BSU is surviving and growing, and we're trying to reach out as much as possible to students amongst our busy lives and keep things in perspective. Like you say, racism and discrimination, oppression, and the inequalities can be sort of tiring and cumbersome. And so we also want to take the aspect of celebrating color and celebrating our contributions as well, and be more positive about gathering together and navigating systems, and representing also the positive side of being in these situations and overcoming, if you will. So we're still there and working on it.
Thank you. If there's more ways we can support, I think that's our intention. So
Well,
please.
I'm glad you mentioned it, because we have a discussion coming up next week called The Intersectionality by the Diversity Group, the first of their group, although that's not a BSU thing that's put on a presentation, just to help support the diversity group, because this is their first dialogue discussion as well. So we'd love to see you guys there on the 26th. I don't know the time, but of course you all get those emails and I send them out a lot. I'll send another one as well after this conversation.
That's wonderful. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you
so
again.
much, 'cause this will be on the recording, so people who are catching this later can hear that. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I like Carol's suggestion of a Caste Part 2 discussion. I think this could spur people to read, and then we could always follow up with more discussion. But thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and
Thank you,
your
everyone.
contributions. And thank you so much to Kirsten and Elaine for starting us off today. Appreciate
It
you.
was a pleasure, as always.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm trying to
Thank
put this
you.
in the link for
Thanks, Carol
that.
and Nicole.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
Thank
a
you,
good
Jack.
week, everyone. Bye-bye.
What's that?
Have a good week.
Oh, thank you all.
Bye.
It was a wonderful
Bye,
conversation.
Carol.
Bye.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
Just a heads up, the diversity dialogue on the 26th starts at 5.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much,
love.
because I didn't have it up. Thank you for doing it justice.
Thank you
Awesome.
for putting that in the chat. Yep.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't have the time there. I was trying to be quick before everyone left.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Thanks, love.
Welcome.
All right.
Can I log off now? Do I log off now?
Yeah, well, so we usually chat a little bit with each other after